Greetings to you. I hope you are doing well and are having a productive day. Welcome to another episode of the Why Lead Others podcast, and I am your host, Ben Oden. Now, the former president of the US, Truman, has this quote where he says, "Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers." And today we're being hosted by Uongozi Institute Leadership Resource Center, and I think it's quite opportune that we're being hosted based on the content of our conversation today. Now, I've been a member of this Institute and Resource Center for a number of years now, and I've greatly benefited from their vast selection of books covering different topics from leadership, self-development, sustainability, politics. They have research, a catalog of research papers as well. So if you're interested in leadership, or if you are a leader and you're interested in growth, I would highly recommend that you actually make time to visit this resource center and check out their selection of books. They are located on the third floor of the JNICC building here in town. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's the Julius Nyerere International Convention Center. It's located in the city center of Dar es Salaam. If you live in Dar es Salaam, or even if you visit Dar es Salaam, I would highly encourage you to pay the visit. Now, for those of you who've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that every now and again we have a habit of sitting down and dissecting concepts, frameworks, stories from a book, because again, we believe that leaders are readers. And today is one of those episodes where we're taking that same approach. And so today we'll be discussing a book that, if you are even remotely interested in philosophy, you've heard about the author of this book. And the author is Plato. And the book is called The Republic, which is a widely regarded book on philosophy and justice and happiness. And it has helped sharpen the thinking of a lot of leaders across centuries. And to have this conversation, I am joined by a guest who is an emerging leader and a practicing lawyer. Her name is Rachel Maximilian Magege, and I'll be having this conversation with her, and we'll be dissecting the concepts from the book, and we'll see where this conversation goes. Rachel, karibu.
Thank you so much, Ben. I am so happy to be here.
Now, I would like to start by playing a game where I would give you two options, and then you would choose one, and you would tell me why you chose one of the two that I have thrown your way. The first is time versus money. If you were to choose one, time or money, which one would it be?
I would choose time.
Why time?
I would choose time because time would allow me to do a lot of things which would actually get me more money, rather than if I would have just chosen money, I would have used it all and the money would have gone. But time would give me more space, more opportunities to do other things, including making more money.
Nice. Now, you're interested in philosophy. You've studied philosophy. There are two frameworks of thinking. One says the end justifies the means, meaning you do everything based on where you'll end up, versus the means justify the end. Now, these two ways of thinking and living can define how your life ends up. Which one do you tend to subscribe to more often?
Thank you so much, Ben. This is something we discussed a lot back in my days in university. And the one that I would always feel geared towards was the means justify the ends. Just because I believe that if you already have an end in mind and you do whatever it takes to do, even if you justify it, you might have hurt someone, you might have really caused a lot of pain, but then you always justify that I had to do this towards this end. But I think we should focus more on the means and how we do something rather than what end we want to achieve, because the end isn't always certain.
I like that, and I think there's a popular phrase these days, right? Trust the process. There's an elevation of the concept of the process, meaning that how you do something probably matters more in most cases than where you actually end up at the end of the day. Now, in this book that we'll be discussing, The Republic by Plato, which captures the thoughts and the ideas of one of my favorite philosophers, Socrates, and there is a line in that book where they say that the beginning is the most important part of any work. The beginning is the most important part of any work. And of course, that sets as a backdrop for one of my favorite books from a recent thinker, which is Simon Sinek, right? Start with why, meaning the beginning is the most important part of the work. And if we connect it with the separate idea, Start with Why by Simon Sinek, what is your why?
Thank you so much, Ben. And I do agree that the beginning is the most important part. So for me, the why always brings me back to my principles, brings me back to the things that I value. So I would say generally in life, my why would be, how it can benefit other people. I don't try to look at it in terms of doing this for me and myself being the why. No, the why for me is about the external influence.
So if I was to reiterate what you've just said, for you, a why is as long as it reaches other people, as long as it improves the life of someone outside of yourself.
Yes.
That's the compass that you use to make your decisions in. Now, among many things, I love the allegories and the stories in the book, and I'm sure you have your own favorite ones, but I think one that I would highlight is the story of the cave, right? Where, for those who have not read this book, it's a story where it's like people who've been born and raised in a cave, chained to a wall, and their whole life they see projections, shadows of objects that the people who've maybe chained them are using. So it could be a toy of a horse, but looking at the shadow is this huge horse that's being projected. And the underlying message there is really this whole idea of ignorance versus education. How sometimes it's almost like a metaphor for how ignorance, they've lived their entire lives in the cave. All they see are projections that people control what they see. And eventually someone breaks out. They go into the outside where they see the real life. They see the sun, they see other things. And they try to come back and rescue the rest, but there's a resistance because you've lived in the cave for so long that the outside is scary. And I think that mirrors where we live today, where I think some people say, truth is stranger than fiction, because many of us tend to prefer, or at least we've been programmed to accept the lies that we receive. And I think in recent entertainment, there's a movie, The Matrix, where it's almost like the movie is a copy of this story. The idea that we're living in an alternate reality that's not grounded in any truth, so to speak. So in your own life, living in the world that we live in today, where it's hard to know what's the truth, it's hard to know the credibility of a lot of things that we hear, because information is moving and being produced and really distributed at a very, very rapid pace. How do you distinguish basically the truth from a lie, and how do you make sure that you develop a certain level of resilience, that you don't find it comfortable to hide behind, a world of lies, so to speak? I mean, we tell our own personal lies sometimes. There are people who are, whether in personal relationships or in the workplace, where you choose to believe a lie because sometimes a lie is comfortable. It's versus actually confronting the truth. So how do you stay in a place in this modern world we live in today where you are grounded in the truth and you are always interrogating things so that truth and lie are always clear and ignorance is not your state of being?
Thank you so much, Ben. I like to ask questions. That's how I find my truth. I like to research and I like to ask questions, and I like to, as much as possible, to find answers for myself. See, when you look at the allegory of the cave, which, like you, is one of my favorite, I would say, stories or illustrations in the Republic, these prisoners or these people who are chained in the cave were comfortable being chained and did not ask, why do we see shadows, or why is this shadow always this same shape? Why is it maybe long or short? And why is this shadow only portrayed for this amount of time every day? So they were comfortable with that. And that's how we tend to be. Most of us in life, we are comfortable with what we know. And there's nothing wrong with that, to be honest. There's nothing wrong with that. But also when we look at, in a similar way, with the people who were chained in this cave, they were already brought up in that system, because the Republic tells us that they were there from birth. So meaning that in our different lives, in our different cultures, contexts, the way we have been brought up and raised in life, once we get to an age of maturity, we already have a big part of our lives, foundations that have already made us who we are. So you can either choose to continue living that way, depending on what you want to do in life and where you want to go, or you can try to, as one of the persons in the cave, get out of the cave, try to walk out of the cave and see what's out there, what is truth, what is not. So that's something that I like to do, to be honest. I I do receive a lot of information and I read a lot of things, but at the end of the day, I do my best to tell myself that my acceptance or my understanding of this type of information should not just end at what the book told me or what this website told me. Let me go and find out more for myself. Thus, walking out of the cave and seeing what is true. And so with that, if I can also just give one additional point, is that we also need to come to a point where we are accepting and flexible of a different opinion or a different story or a different narrative or a different shadow, if I may, like in the example of the Republic. Because if you've been brought up in a certain way your whole life and you have believed a certain thing, it can be true or not, or it can be good or bad. But let's say in one way or another, it is maybe a stereotype or a bad thing. And then you reach somewhere and you find a different narrative or different information. Will you truly accept it or not? Because one of the prisoners, one of the people, as illustrated by Plato in this book, when he walked out of the cave, it was said that the sun would blind his eyes and he was not comfortable with that, or the sounds of trees and birds was something very foreign to him. It scared him. So such a person would feel more comfortable going back to the cave, being chained up and just watching the shadows rather than enjoying the colors and the birds and the trees. So at the end of the day, it's very subjective. Truth, education, what we do, it's subjective. So each person has to figure it out for themselves.
I mean, I think it's funny. So now I'll bring in a cultural angle to this, right? I'm sure you've experienced this personally, where sometimes, social circles, in a corporate setting, someone is giving you information and, you ask them, where did you get this information? And I don't think English quite captures what I'm about to say, but I think in Swahili there is that phrase, right? Niamini mimi, where someone is telling you, giving you information and emphasizing that just to trust what I have to say. And I think in many communities, really, when someone you trust gives you information, this comes from parenting to teachers to colleagues, leadership, that trust tends to sometimes overpower reason, where you, because of the trust that's established, you abandon your reason sometimes to do that. So how do you, I guess, based on your response, how do you make sure that even in a situation where the trust is established, you still give yourself space to reason without the, and being okay with disagreeing? Because I think sometimes disagreeing with people you love, disagreeing with people you trust is uncomfortable. There's like a sense of dissonance where you feel like, okay, what does this necessarily mean? So sometimes to protect that ourselves and our own feelings and to avoid dissonance, we accept, even though there is tension inside of you, like, is this really true? Is this really not? So in a context where there's a trust relationship that's clearly established, how do you develop the ability to form your own point of view, to disagree, I guess, in a way that does not damage that trust relationship that's already established?
All right. I remember being in my second year, my sophomore year in university, and majoring in philosophy. We took a class called ethics. And in ethics, we learned about exactly what you're saying in terms of culture. So there was a big concept that I still remember to this day called cultural relativism, which means that the standards of good and bad, right and wrong, depend on a certain culture and what they have established. And so those standards or principles vary from one culture to another. What might be right or wrong from your culture does not have to be the same for me. So we dived really deep into that discussion, and I really enjoyed it. So maybe I would say what I do in a practical sense is I do love my culture very much. I am a proud Tanzanian. I'm a proud African. And so being brought up in this culture, being brought up in this context, there are many things that I have learned. Now, can I say that I agree and love all of them? To be honest, no. There are certain things that I think I personally, as I've developed as a person, have found them out not to be exactly right or even morally good according to how I define morality. But it's what my tribe does. It's what my culture does. So I think at the end of the day, you need to understand yourself as a person. You need to have that self-identity and know that, yes, I've been brought up in this way. My culture, my environment tells me that this is right. And the people I trust have held on to these morals and these standards. But I have to make this decision for myself. At the end of the day, it's about thinking for yourself. Yes, we respect our elders. And given that we come from an African context, I am a very big champion of respecting our elders, respecting our culture. But I also think that should not be at the expense of losing yourself and losing your own voice. So that's the perception and the principle that I have made for myself.
Wow. And I would assume that someone has to have a certain level of, I guess, self-esteem or a sense of self-worth that is independent sometimes of the community around you, so that you're firmly rooted. But I think if your identity is defined by everything that is around you, that can be a bit of a challenge. And I think that's why you would find that sometimes in individualistic societies like the West, people tend to be more free in their thinking because individualism is promoted. But I think in communities like ourselves, where really the community, even a concept as Ubuntu, right? I am because we are. It puts you in a position where you have to define yourself within the context of the larger community around you. But I think even in that setup, like you're saying, thinking for yourself is definitely something that can be done, or at least it should be something that we all aspire to reach. Now, there are questions that we tend to ask all of our guests who come to the podcast, right? It's called the 111, which is, what is the one book you wish you'd read earlier in your life? What is the one habit you wish you'd developed earlier in your life as well? And what is the one value that you will not compromise no matter what? Now, you've made mention of principles and values that you stand by. Now, of course, we're not perfect beings. We make mistakes. We violate some of the things that we say we stand for. But what is the one value that you will stand for, no matter the cost? And what is the habit that you wish maybe you had developed a few years earlier? And what is the one book that you wish, assuming that it was published, it could be a book that you read last year, but you're like, I wish this book was available 10 years ago. So what is the one book that you wish you read earlier? What is the one value that you will not compromise no matter the cost? And what is the one habit that you wish you developed earlier as well?
Thank you so much, Ben. I really, really like that question because I do not have one book per se that I wish I had read earlier. But if you can allow me, I would like to say in terms of books, because I know that they are written. I may not know the exact name of the book, but I do wish I had read a little bit more about African philosophers. Just any book, any narrative that has come from an African author looking at philosophy in that context. So you'll forgive me if I don't have a specific book in mind. I do remember back in school reading books, Things Fall Apart, and different other books from African authors by Chinua Achebe. But I didn't really see much on African philosophy and even books that show a positive side of African history. I came to learn those things as an adult, and I learned those things through articles and even social media pages. So those are things that I really wish I had learned and read a little bit more. And also with that, my value to this day, something that I definitely hold of immense value is always making sure to showcase and have empathy. So that is a very big thing for me. And it's even one of the reasons why I really enjoyed philosophy and why I even use it in my practice as a lawyer. I think society has made it seem like, having empathy is a sign of weakness, or having empathy is a sign of being too emotional. But that is a principle and value that I hold no matter what. In everything that I do, I always have that context back at the back of my mind, that I should have empathy and showcase empathy. I think that's also something that leadership can do more. If they have that context, if they have that principle with them at all times, it can really be shown in what they do and how they lead people. And that also brings me to the last point that I had wanted to make. If I can, going back to the book and in answering your question, in terms of habit and the different principles that I do. So there is another story in the Republic that talks about how to define a just person from an unjust person. And they talk about another allegory on the ring of Gyges. So that for me, even reading it the first time, and even when I read it again, it really makes me think a lot about who I am as a person or the people around me. This ring had the power to make you invisible. And so when this young shepherd boy found this ring, he was just a normal person, but he used this ring and discovered that it could make him invisible. So he overthrew the king of the land and seduced the queen and did so many other things. So the main and the general theme that the author was trying to say is, what would a person actually do if the fear of being caught was taken away from them? The fear of responsibility, the fear of being held accountable. What would they do? So one of the other people that Plato was discussing with were saying people will absolutely be unjust. They will be cruel. There's just injustice reigns over justice. So it makes us think a lot. So those are the habits, those are the introspections that I have in my life. And I think they have really guided me towards a more beautiful path on having empathy and reaching out and exploring our African books and African authorship.
I know Wongozi has a great selection of books published by African authors. So maybe you could explore that section of the resource center and then see. But I also agree with you, with the allegory that you just shared. And that's why I love the definition of integrity that says integrity is behaving in the way that you say that you're behaving when no one is watching, right? So again, addressing that bit where how do you operate, how do you move when no one is watching? When there will never be any record of you doing that thing, will you still stand by those values, right? That's the true test of integrity. Now, the last thing that I would like to ask you, in the book, there is this conversation that happens between Socrates and Cephalus, which I believe is the brother of Plato. And when we talk about, he, at this point in the story, he is someone who had become successful and rich and wealthy. And so there's a conversation around, okay, now that you're wealthy, of course, there's wealth and justice. Is it possible to be wealthy and be just? But I think Socrates asks him a question in terms of what it's like to be rich, and there is a response that he gives that I would like to quote here. This is the English translation, so I don't know if we read the same translation, but there is something that he said where he says that he is happy to have escaped, of course, his youthful appetites, but at the same time, there is something that he says that really stands out to me. He says, wealth in age provides a man with the liberty of always telling the truth. Wealth in age provides a man with the liberty of always telling the truth. And the underlying idea here is that when you've accumulated wealth, there are very few things that you need that you can't access. And so you don't really need anything. So as a result, you don't feel the need to finesse your way around things. You don't feel the need to manipulate. You don't feel the need to do any of those things because you have the resources to move a lot of spaces. But I think I disagree with that way of thinking, meaning that I think that people should be at a position where they tell the truth, even if you don't necessarily have all the resources. Because I think, of course, telling the truth is costly. Sometimes if you tell the truth, certain doors will be closed. And if you don't have certain resources, those doors will never open. And so a lot of people, and I have no data when I say a lot of people here, so I could be wrong, but I would say a significant number of people live with this belief that if we go back to what I asked you earlier, if the means should justify the end, I would probably not achieve my goals. I would probably not reach my dreams. So I will do whatever it takes, which means if I have to lie along the way, I will do that. And then once I have accumulated the resources, be it network of relationships, be it material gains, be it favor from the government, whatever it is, when I reach that point where I am protected, then I will start telling the truth. Because at that point, I can protect myself. And if I was to quote a contemporary rapper, Kanye West, he said that no one can cancel a billionaire. He was telling that, so which is, as you can see in the media, he says and does whatever he wants because he says no one can cancel me. I'm a billionaire. People can cancel people who are on the up and up, but you can't cancel me. You can dislike me, but you can't. And so for someone who lives like that, someone who has chosen to abandon this virtue of truth as a logical reason that this is going to help me propel and grow in life. And then once I've reached a certain point, maybe I'll be truthful at that point. For someone who chooses to live like that, how would you challenge them to rethink their way of operating and living and to embrace this virtue of truth, even at this point of, emergence that they're in?
All right. What a lovely question. Yes, because reading that quote, and I do remember coming across it many times, it was really funny. And I do agree with you that probably what he said may not apply to us and even to me. And then I also remember him further going on and saying that at the end of the day, all of these things do not really mean much if your soul cannot go back to the gods. And we have to understand this was a very different time. The book was written or let's say discussed maybe at that time during around 370 BC. And we are looking at a people who are very different from us. These were Greeks in the West. We are Africans. And we are in 2022, and this was back in 300 BC. So it made me think a lot, to be honest. And I'm so glad you brought up this question, because if we're looking at matters of wealth, matters of truth, there are some things that are timeless. Some of the concepts that he talked about in the book still do apply today and even to different cultures and different people. So with people who have that way of thinking and that mindset, I would say to them that I believe truth is objective. Now, if we're talking about like the smaller truths, like there's maybe a sub-truth that can apply to different people and might not be objective to all, maybe it's subjective to this person or that person. But I believe that it is best for a person to be a lover of truth, a seeker of truth. And with that, there is a power and a virtue that comes with it. Because I don't believe that truth is just a fact, 1 + 1 is 2. There is something much bigger to truth, even spiritual, I can say. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, these were philosophers. Even the word itself, philosopher, means a lover of wisdom. So with that, they would try to find wisdom in their own human way, truth. So I think people should try to also practice introspection. They should also practice just finding things out for themselves, and not necessarily, because let's be honest, even the whole concept of wealth or what you can do with it, or even what Kanye West has said, these are things that I believe were formed slowly and constructed and became the norm, and were taught and spread around and became a norm. But if you have time to just sit quiet and think for yourself and be by yourself, and try as much as possible to shut out the voices and the words coming from outside, I think to some extent you will find that truth for yourself. Yes.
I like what you finished with there, because I have a book sitting here with me, I think, for those who are watching. It's called Noise by Daniel Kahneman, who's known for writing the book Thinking Fast and Slow. And the book really talks about this flaw in human judgment, where we live in a world where there is so much noise that making a decision sometimes is very hard. But if we actually take a moment to pause and really empty all the noise from our minds, we can develop that ability to think for yourself. But I also think that making a decision or living your life purely based on the knowledge base that you have is not necessarily the best way to go about it. We live in a world where, thankfully, the printing press, was invented, 1,500 years? 500 years ago in Germany. And now we live in a world where there's so much knowledge. to acquire. And that's why we're in this beautiful resource center here, because there's so much to accumulate. And so I would just encourage and urge our listeners and viewers that if you're a leader, if you're someone who is interested in living a value-driven life, if you're someone who is interested in becoming the very best version of themselves, I think reading and studying should not even be an option. That should be the norm. And for that, we thank the resource center like this one, where you can actually literally come and get access to all these books that otherwise could have been expensive for some people to purchase. But here you come, you can borrow a book, you read and you return it back. And then again, but even as you read, you know that I have to also exercise independent thinking. I have to think for myself, even as I am acquiring all this knowledge. Rachel, thank you so much for having this conversation with me and sitting down and talking. And yeah, I've enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully it's not the last one. But before we wrap up this conversation, what last words would you, and I've asked someone this before and they said, I'm not dying. Why would you say last words? But what parting words do you have for our audience?
To our lovely audience, one thing that I can definitely tell you is to love yourself and to just be yourself. Now, this can sound very common and very cliche, but there's power to it. There's power to it. If you can, and I say this again, if you can try to just shut out the noise, if you can try to just take a walk by yourself, read a book by yourself. The world today has made it seem like if you go to the movies or to eat at a restaurant by yourself, you're lonely and depressed. Let me tell you, Ben, I go to movies by myself. I can take a trip to Bagamoyo and just go to these museums and historical places by myself. There is a joy to spending time by yourself, because I think also a lot of people do not have that self-identity or know exactly who they are, their strengths, their weaknesses, their demons, their good side, bad side, because they don't take time to be by themselves. The world makes it seem like you must have a problem if you like being by yourself. But I want to encourage our audience members, even as we are here and we're promoting good leadership, self-development, philosophy, psychology, take time to know yourself. For example, if you are somewhere and you see a little child or just any person fall down and they hurt themselves, a part of you in your heart, even if you might not get up and do something, a part of you will jump, and other people will literally stand up and help them up their feet, wipe their bruises. And so that shows that we do have, deep down inside, we do have a level of compassion and love. If you can do that for a child or a stranger, why not do that for yourself? Wrap up and wipe off your bruises and the dust from yourself. Like, I know this part of me is not okay. Let me take some time for myself. Let me do this. So spend time with people. Absolutely. Have mentors, have friends, fellowships, but spend time with yourself and love yourself and take care of yourself even as much as you do for other people. So that will help us. So my love and my message to all of you, our wonderful audience members.
Wow. Love yourself. I think those are the words. For our dear listener and viewer, this has been the Why Lead Others podcast, brought to you by the Uongozi Institute Leadership Resource Center, and I have been your host, Ben Oden.